The solitude of the Wyoming high country was a balm Isaac Thorne applied to wounds he could not name. It was 1874, and the war was nearly a decade gone, but its ghost still walked with him in the thin, cold air. His cabin, a squat, sturdy structure of hewn logs, stood a stone's throw from the Wind River, its back pressed against a stand of unyielding pines. He had built it himself, a fortress against memory, against the world of men that had failed him so profoundly. He was a tall man, made lean and hard by constant labor. His face, weathered by a relentless sun and an unforgiving wind, was a map of past hardships, with lines etched deep around eyes the color of a stormy sky. His hands were calloused and capable, as comfortable with an axe as they had once been with a rifle. He worked as a ranch hand for a cattleman whose spread was a half-day's ride away, a lonely job that paid him in supplies and the precious right to be left entirely alone. Town was a place he avoided with a visceral distaste. Lander was a raw, burgeoning settlement filled with the kind of noise and boisterous judgment he had come west to escape. He saw in the faces of the townsfolk the same blind, unthinking certainty that had sent boys, his own younger brother Thomas among them, marching into the meat grinder of war. The thunder of cannon still echoed in his quietest moments, a phantom roar that drowned out the whisper of the wind, so he kept to his cabin, to the solemn company of the river and the unsparing, silent mountains. That spring had been a particularly bitter one. A late, heavy snow in May had blanketed the high peaks, and now, under the relentless sun of early June, the melt came fast and furious. The Wind River, usually a clear, placid ribbon of blue, had transformed into a churning, mud-brown beast, its roar a constant, menacing presence that vibrated through the floorboards of his cabin. He was checking his horse's shoes near the small corral, the metallic rasp of the file the only sound competing with the river, when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the wilderness. It was human. A thin, desperate shriek, swallowed almost immediately by the river's growl. Isaac froze, his head cocked, every nerve on high alert. He thought, for a fleeting moment, that he had imagined it. Another phantom from a past filled with the cries of dying men. Then it came again, fainter this time, but unmistakable. A cry for help. His body moved before his mind had fully consented. He dropped the file into the dust and ran toward the river bank, his eyes scanning the violent torrent. And then he saw it, a flash of dark fabric and pale skin, a single figure tangled in the skeletal branches of a fallen cottonwood that was being battered by the main force of the current. The person was caught, a fragile anchor in a world of violent, unstoppable motion. He did not hesitate. He kicked off his heavy boots, unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground, and plunged into the icy water. The shock of the cold was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. The current was a living thing, a powerful, unseen muscle that grabbed at his legs, trying to pull him under and sweep him away. He fought it, his arms churning in powerful strokes, his eyes locked on the figure in the tree. As he got closer, he saw it was a young woman, Chinese, her dark hair plastered to her pale face. Her arms were hooked desperately around a thick branch, her body held half out of the water. But it was the gentle, unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the soaked cotton dress that made his heart stop for a beat. She was with child. He reached the cottonwood, gasping for air, the cold having seeped deep into his bones. "Hold on," he yelled over the roar of the water. He grabbed a sturdy limb, anchoring himself against the relentless pull of the river, and reached for her. Her eyes, dark and almond-shaped, were wide with a primal fear. "I'm here to help," he shouted, his voice strained. She looked at him, her gaze flickering from his face to the treacherous current and back again. She was trembling uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from sheer terror. He saw that one of her legs was wedged tightly between two gnarled branches just below the waterline, trapping her. "I have to get you free," he yelled. "I'm going under." She gave a tiny, frightened nod. He took a deep, burning breath, submerged himself in the frigid, murky water, and worked blindly with his hands. The pressure of the current was immense, pushing him against the snag. His lungs burned for air. He felt the rough bark scrape his skin as he pushed and pulled at the branches, trying to create enough space to free her trapped limb. Finally, with a great, desperate heave, he forced the branches apart, and her leg came free. He surfaced, sputtering, his vision blurring. She was limp now, her head lolling to the side, her grip on the branch faltering. Using the last of his strength, he wrapped one arm securely around her waist, mindful of her condition, and pulled her away from the snag. The fight back to shore was a brutal, exhausting battle. He half dragged, half carried her, his legs numb, his muscles screaming in protest. He stumbled out of the water and collapsed on the muddy bank, his chest heaving, his body feeling like a block of ice. He rolled onto his side and pressed his fingers to her neck. He felt a pulse, faint and thready, but it was there. She coughed, a racking, painful sound, and a stream of river water trickled from her mouth. Her eyelids fluttered open. "Easy now," he said, his voice a rough, breathless rasp. "You're safe." She stared at him, her eyes still clouded with confusion and terror. She tried to push herself up, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. "My baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're on my land," he told her, trying to keep his voice steady. "Near the Wind River. You need to get warm, both of you." "My cabin is close." He rose shakily to his feet and reached a hand down to help her. She flinched away from his touch, scrambling backward in the mud like a startled deer. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Do not take us to town, please." Her plea was so filled with a palpable dread it stopped him cold. "I'm not taking you to town," he said gruffly. "But you'll die of cold out here. The cabin is your only choice." She watched him for a long, agonizing moment, her dark eyes searching his face, weighing one unknown danger against another. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she relented. She tried to stand, but her legs gave way beneath her. Without another word, Isaac scooped her gently into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a bird-bone fragility that felt alien in his grasp. She went stiff at his touch but did not fight him. He carried her to the cabin, the short walk feeling like a mile. He pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder and carried her inside. The small, one-room space was spare and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a narrow cot beside it, a rough-sawn table, and two simple chairs. But it was the scent of the place, of wood smoke, coffee, and solitude, that seemed to unnerve her the most. She was an intrusion into his fortress, and they both knew it. He set her down carefully in the chair closest to the hearth. "Get those wet things off," he ordered, his back already turned as he knelt to add more wood to the embers in the fireplace. It was a command born of pure practicality, not intimacy. He did not look at her, giving her what little privacy the small room allowed. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the violent chattering of her teeth. He felt a flash of irritation, a deep resentment at this disruption. He had not asked for this, for a half-drowned, pregnant woman with fear in her eyes to shatter the quiet, predictable rhythm of his life. Yet, as he listened to the soft rustle of wet fabric being peeled from skin, a different feeling stirred in him, something akin to a reluctant, protective curiosity. Who was she, and what was she running from that was worse than a flooded river? He finally allowed himself to look at her. She was huddled in his spare blanket, her wet clothes draped over the other chair. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and bruises were already beginning to purple on her pale skin. She looked impossibly young and terribly vulnerable. "My name is Isaac Thorne," he said, his voice softer than he intended, breaking the heavy silence. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time without immediate, reflexive fear. "I am Mai," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic. He made her a cup of hot, bitter coffee, and she sipped it with trembling hands, the warmth slowly chasing some of the chill from her body. He watched her, noting the way she flinched when a log popped in the fire, the way her gaze darted to the door every few minutes. She was wound tight with secrets and terror. As dusk settled over the valley, an awkward tension fell between them. There was only one cot. "You take the bed," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll sleep by the fire." She nodded, her eyes downcast, a silent acknowledgement of his gruff kindness. He laid out his bedroll on the rough plank floor, keeping his back to her as she moved to the cot. He was acutely aware of her every movement, the soft rustle of the blanket as she settled in. He stared into the dying embers, willing sleep to come, but his mind was agitated, unsettled by her presence. The cabin felt smaller, the air charged with a strange, unfamiliar intimacy. He must have drifted off, because her voice startled him out of a shallow, uneasy sleep. It came out of the darkness, a trembling whisper. "Mr. Thorne?" He did not move, did not turn. "What is it?" There was a long pause. He could hear the unsteady rhythm of her breathing. "Sir," her voice came again, even quieter. "Do you want to look at me?" The question hit him like a stray bullet. He remained frozen, his back to her, every muscle in his body tense. Then her voice came once more, laced with a heartbreaking resignation. "Will you stay if I undress?" In those words, he heard the echo of 100 sordid transactions he could only imagine. He heard the shame, the desperation, the awful, hollow bartering of a woman with nothing left to sell but herself. She was offering him a payment for her rescue, for the food, for the shelter. A hot, unfamiliar shame washed over him, mingled with a surge of protective anger, at her, at the men who had driven her to this, at a world that could break a person down to such a point. He turned his head just enough to see her silhouette in the dim firelight. She was standing by the cot, clutching the blanket to her chest, a single fragile shape in the vast darkness. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his body fully away from her, presenting her with nothing but his rigid back. He stared hard into the glowing coals, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "No one is going to bother you here." He did not hear her move for a long time. When she finally did, it was the quiet sound of the cot ropes creaking under her weight, followed by a soft, choked sob that she tried and failed to stifle in the darkness. Isaac Thorne lay on the hard floor, listening to the sound of her weeping and the unabated roar of the river, feeling the first, painful crack spread across the frozen walls he had built around his heart. The night's raw confession hung in the air between them long after the fire had died. The swollen river made travel impossible for days, trapping them in a world no bigger than Isaac's small plot of land. Mai, it turned out, was not a woman who could abide idleness. She fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm with him. She cooked and cleaned with a quiet, tireless efficiency, her hands always busy, her movements graceful despite her growing belly. She spoke to him in fragmented English, and he found himself listening intently, piecing together the fragments of her story. Her father had come from across the ocean to work on the railroad, a man chasing a dream of gold and a better life for his family. He had died in a rock slide a month ago, leaving her orphaned and in debt to the cruel camp foreman, a man named Corbett. Corbett had claimed that her father's debt now belonged to him, along with all his meager possessions, including his daughter. She was property to be collected. She had packed what little she owned and fled in the dead of night, only to be caught by the raging river. Isaac listened, his face a granite mask. He knew the kind of men who ran labor camps. He understood the casual cruelty, the utter lack of law or mercy in those remote places. As she spoke of her fear, he found himself, to his own surprise, speaking of his own. He told her of the war, of his brother Thomas, who had died of dysentery in a fetid camp in Virginia without ever seeing a real battle. He told her how he'd come back to a home that no longer felt like his own, his future gone, and how he'd come west to lose himself in the vast, empty spaces. Their confessions hung in the small cabin, a fragile bridge of shared ruin. For the first time, Mai looked at him not as a savior or a potential threat, but as a man who understood the universal language of grief. Their companionship became a thing of quiet spaces and small gestures. A language grew between them in the way he left a bucket of fresh water for her by the door each morning, and the way she left a hot cup of coffee for him on the hearth before he went out. For the first time since the war, Isaac felt the sharp, painful edges of his solitude begin to soften. Her presence was a low, steady warmth against the persistent chill of his memories. But with this growing comfort came an unwelcome awareness. One hot afternoon, he came back to the cabin and saw her down at the creek, which had receded to a gentle stream, washing her long black hair. The sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods, dappling her skin. It was a simple, innocent act, but watching her, Isaac felt a powerful, visceral jolt of desire. It was so sharp and unexpected that he turned away abruptly, his heart hammering in his chest, ashamed of the thoughts that had risen so easily. She was a survivor he had sworn to protect, a guest in his home. She was not for him to want. The outside world intruded on the fourth day. Isaac saw a rider coming from a long way off. A flicker of panic crossed Mai's face. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. "Just a hand from the ranch," Isaac said, trying to reassure her. "He won't bother you," but as the rider drew closer, Isaac's gut tightened. It wasn't one of the ranch hands. It was a stout, hard-faced man he didn't recognize, followed by two others. Corbett. The name was a cold stone in his stomach. Mai saw him, too, and all the color drained from her face. She scrambled back into the cabin like a mouse darting from a hawk. Corbett and his men reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and menace. "Well, well," Corbett called out, his eyes sweeping over the small homestead. "Looks like my property has wandered off." He dismounted, his movement slow and deliberate. "I've come for what's mine, Thorn. The girl and the debt she owes me." "She doesn't owe you anything," Isaac said, his voice dangerously calm. He stood on the porch, a solid, immovable wall. His gun was not drawn, but his hand hovered near its hilt. "Stay out of this, Yankee," one of Corbett's men growled. "This is our business." "She is my business now," Isaac replied, his voice flat and final. Corbett spat on the ground and lunged for the cabin door. Isaac moved with the speed of a striking snake. He shoved Corbett back with one hand and drew his pistol with the other. But he had underestimated them. The second hired man was already moving, not with a gun, but with a long, wicked-looking knife. As Isaac turned, the man rushed him, the blade a silver arc. Isaac parried the first thrust, the steel scraping against his gun barrel. He brought the heavy pistol down in a brutal arc, catching the man on the side of the head. The man staggered, but he was tough. He came back, jabbing low. Isaac felt a sudden white-hot fire in his left side. He grunted as the blade sank into his ribs. He stumbled back, a dark, wet stain already spreading across his shirt. Mai screamed from inside the cabin. The world seemed to slow down. She saw Isaac stagger, his face contorting in pain. She saw Corbett smile, a cruel, triumphant smirk. In that moment, something inside her snapped. The fear, the grief, the years of helplessness, they burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, protective rage. The heavy iron skillet she'd been using to cook sat on the hearth. Without thinking, she grabbed it. As the man who had stabbed Isaac turned toward the door, Mai burst out, swinging the skillet with all her might. The heavy cast iron connected with the man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. Everything froze. Corbett and his remaining man stared, stunned, at the pregnant woman holding the skillet, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing. In that frozen moment, Isaac, despite the searing pain in his side, pushed himself off the wall. He fired his pistol, not at Corbett, but at the ground near his feet. The shot kicked up a spray of dirt that made Corbett yelp and jump back. "Get out of here," Isaac growled, his voice strained but full of lethal menace. "And if you ever come back, I'll bury you on this land." Corbett looked from Isaac's smoking gun to the unconscious man on the ground, and then to Mai, who stood defiantly on the porch, skillet still held like a weapon. The odds had changed. He cursed, grabbed the reins of his man's horse, and rode away, leaving his wounded companion in the dust. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain and healing. The doctor from Lander, summoned by a ranch hand Isaac sent, declared that the knife had missed anything vital but had gone deep. Isaac's small cabin became a sick bed. Time was measured by the changing of bandages and the slow return of color to his face. Mai never left his side. She was a fierce, tireless guardian of his recovery, her role shifting from the rescued to the caretaker. In this crucible of vulnerability, the last of their walls crumbled. He was no longer just the strong rescuer, and she was no longer a fragile victim. They were a man and a woman bound by a shared fight for survival. In the long, quiet nights, his own ghosts came for him. The war, which he had kept locked away for a decade, broke free in his fevered dreams. He would cry out in his sleep, his body thrashing. "Thomas," he would shout, his voice thick with an old, unhealed agony. Mai did not try to wake him. Instead, she would lean close, her voice a lifeline in his sea of memory. "You are not there, Isaac," she would whisper, her hand on his forehead. "The war is over. You are here with us. You are safe." She would describe the room, the pattern of the moonlight on the floor, the weight of the quilt, until the tension left his body and he would quiet, his hand finding hers in the darkness. She was calming the ghosts that had haunted his solitude for so long. His physical strength returned slowly. The birth came on a warm night in late August, sooner than they expected. Her labor began with a quiet gasp in the middle of the night. There was no time to fetch a doctor or a midwife from town. There was only Isaac, his side still tender, his hand shaking, and Mai, her face pale but her eyes filled with a fierce determination. He boiled water, tore sheets, and coached her with words he didn't know he possessed, words that seemed to rise from some deep, instinctual well of humanity. He held her hand through hours of pain, his fear for her and the child a raw, living thing inside him. And as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, a new sound filled the small cabin, the strong, healthy cry of a baby boy. Isaac cut the cord with a trembling hand and cleaned the infant, his movements clumsy but gentle. He wrapped the baby in a clean cloth and placed him in Mai's arms. He watched as she looked down at her son, a look of such profound, exhausted love on her face that it took his breath away. The tiny cabin, once a fortress of solitude and grief, was now filled with the undeniable, miraculous presence of new life. One afternoon, weeks later, he took his first few shuffling steps to the window, leaning on her for support. They stood there, the baby sleeping peacefully in a cradle Isaac had fashioned from a wooden crate, looking out at the river, now calm and clear. He looked at the woman who had nursed him, who had fought for him, who had faced down his demons and delivered her own child in his home. He saw his future standing right there beside him. The thought of a life without her, without their son, was a cold, empty void he could no longer bear to contemplate. He had nothing to offer but the simple, profound truth of his heart. "This place," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "It could be your home. Our home. If you'll have it." Tears welled in Mai's eyes. She smiled, a fragile, beautiful thing. She was as broken in her own way as he was, but together they were something whole. She answered his offer with a question of her own, the same one from that first terrifying night, but now stripped of all its shame and filled with a new, hopeful meaning. "Will you stay, Isaac?" He did not need to answer with words. He simply leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss of acceptance and promise. He was home. They did not stay in the old cabin. Together, they built a new home on a slight rise overlooking the river, with a wide porch for watching the sunset and a room just for their son, David. They built it with their own hands, every log a testament to the life they were forging together. The seasons turned. Their life settled into a peaceful, hard-working rhythm. One late summer afternoon a year later, they rowed out together along the river, little David secure in a sling against Mai's chest. As they rowed, Mai's hand slipped from her reins and found his. He enclosed it in his own, a simple gesture of belonging. He looked over at her face, which was no longer haunted by fear but was instead softened by love and lit by a genuine, radiant smile. And in that moment, he smiled back, a rare, true smile that reached his stormy eyes and erased the last shadows of the war, of the grief, of the solitude. The pain they had both carried had not vanished. The ghosts were still there. But now they rested quietly, held in the warm, sunlit space of their shared life, no longer a burden to be carried alone.